I was monitoring the atmospheric pressure readings on the outer hull when something caught my eye near the main airlock. I turned around and literally froze in place. Just a few meters from the bright red door of our module stood a massive polar bear, her enormous head lowered, breath escaping in heavy clouds of vapor in the frozen air. In my 20 years working at Arctic research stations, I'd seen hundreds of bears, but never had they come this close to the living quarters, and certainly never stood right at the door as if waiting to be let inside. The bear raised her head, her black eyes met mine, and in that gaze I saw something absolutely incredible. Not aggression, not curiosity, but a desperate plea for help. I moved slowly toward the door, keeping my hands visible and trying not to make sudden movements, though my heart was pounding like crazy. When I got closer, I saw the bear was in horrifying condition. Her normally thick white fur was matted and covered with ice, her sides unnaturally sunken, and her paws trembling from exhaustion. The most striking thing was that her belly was huge and clearly distended. She was pregnant, very far along, and something had gone catastrophically wrong. I carefully opened the door and stepped aside, certain the bear would turn and leave, but instead she slowly, with visible difficulty, crossed the threshold and literally collapsed on the floor in the warm entryway of the station. I quickly closed the outer door and turned on the bright yellow heat lamps, directing them at the bear. She lay on her side, breathing heavily, and when I crouched down beside her to examine her, I suddenly realized I knew this bear. We'd been monitoring the local polar bear population for several years, tracking their movements, watching their health, and this female was one of the regular inhabitants of the island's northern coast. 3 weeks ago, I'd seen her during a routine territory check. Back then, she was also pregnant, but looked completely different, healthy, strong, with shiny, thick fur. That day, she'd settled into her usual spot on a large, stable ice floe, preparing to give birth in peaceful surroundings, and by all our calculations should have delivered in about a month under comfortable conditions. What could have happened in these 3 weeks that transformed a healthy, strong bear into this exhausted, soaked creature lying on the station floor? A low groan of pain escaped from her mouth. Her body convulsed in a spasm, and I understood there was no time for thinking. Labor had begun right now. Water dripped from her nostrils. The fur on her belly and paws was wet. She'd clearly been swimming in icy water for a long time, which for a pregnant bear in late term could be deadly dangerous. I watched as her eyes were half closed from weakness, how muscles trembled on her massive paws, how her breathing quickened. Suddenly her belly tensed, contracted in a powerful contraction, her hind legs kicked, and I saw something dark and wet beginning to emerge from the birth canal. My entire experience was limited to first aid courses for humans that all polar workers take, but there was no choice either. I help right now, or she dies here on the station floor, along with her cub. I grabbed clean towels from the green medical container and prepared to help. The cub was emerging very slowly. The bear tried to push, but was so weakened that the process nearly stopped. The baby was stuck halfway, and if I didn't help right now, it could suffocate. My hands trembled, but I carefully grasped the visible part of the cub's body and began gently pulling in rhythm with the contractions. The bear growled, low, guttural, but didn't try to bite me, as if understanding I was trying to help. After several agonizing minutes, the cub finally slipped into my hands, a tiny ball about the size of a small dog, completely wet, covered with a translucent membrane, with closed eyes and tiny ears pressed to its head. I quickly cleared its nose and mouth of the membrane, expecting the bear to start licking it herself, but she just lay with closed eyes, barely breathing, too weak even to turn her head. Horror gripped me. Newborn bear cubs can't breathe on their own. They need to be stimulated, otherwise they die in the first minutes of life. I grabbed a dry towel and began vigorously rubbing the tiny body, imitating the movements of a mother's tongue. The cub remained motionless. Its little chest didn't rise, tiny paws hung limply. Seconds stretched like hours. I kept rubbing, massaging, desperately hoping for a miracle, and suddenly its chest shuddered, the tiny pink mouth opened, and a weak but so long-awaited squeak rang out, high-pitched, plaintive, demanding. I carefully placed the cub next to the bear's muzzle, hoping the smell and sounds of the baby would give her strength. The little one was covered with sparse light fur through which pink skin showed. Its tiny paws helplessly pawed the air, and moisture seeped from its closed eyes. The bear opened her eyes slightly, weakly sniffed the cub, but then her body seized again in convulsion, powerful, so strong that she let out an almost human groan of pain. I froze in complete bewilderment, The birth was over, the cub was born, but the bear was writhing as if contractions were just beginning. And suddenly it hit me. There was another cub inside, a second one I hadn't even suspected. The second cub began emerging faster than the first. The bear pushed with her last strength, and after a few minutes it slipped into my palms, just as tiny, with the same sparse light fur and pink skin, with tiny black claws on its paws. But unlike the first, this cub was completely motionless. Its chest didn't rise, no sound came from its mouth, the tiny body just lay limply in my palms. I quickly cleared its airways, started rubbing with a towel, massaged the little chest with 2 fingers, but nothing helped. The cub wasn't breathing, its pink skin was starting to take on a bluish tint, and with each second the chances of survival were rapidly falling. In desperation, I carefully placed the lifeless cub right at the bear's muzzle, hoping for a miracle, hoping that maternal instinct would prove stronger than exhaustion. The bear weakly opened her eyes, looked at the motionless baby, and I saw something change in her gaze, as if maternal love proved stronger than deadly exhaustion. She slowly, with enormous effort, raised her massive head and began licking the cub. Her large, rough tongue moved over the tiny body methodically and persistently, from head to tail, again and again, not stopping for a second. I sat nearby, holding my breath, not daring to move. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. The cub remained motionless, and I felt hope beginning to leave me. Maybe it was born already dead. Maybe the premature birth was too hard for it. But the bear kept licking, her tongue moving more and more insistently, more energetically, as if she refused to believe her baby was lost. A minute passed, a minute and a half, and I was ready to gently move the cub away to spare the bear this agonizing hope, but suddenly the tiny chest trembled. It was a barely noticeable movement, so weak I first thought I was seeing things. But the bear felt it and began licking even more actively, her tongue literally massaging the little body, and then the cub shuddered harder. Its little mouth opened slightly, a weak intermittent squeak sounded, then another, slightly louder, then another. Tiny paws jerked, the head turned, seeking maternal warmth, and from its tiny mouth burst an already quite confident, demanding cry. It was breathing. The second cub was alive. Maternal love had literally brought it back from the dead. The bear continued licking both cubs. Her movements were weak, but incredible tenderness could be felt in them. The cubs squeaked, high-pitched, demanding, instinctively crawling to their mother's belly, their tiny noses poking into the fur, seeking nipples. The first cub was already moving its paws quite confidently, while the second still moved awkwardly, as if its body hadn't fully returned to life yet. The next several hours I just sat nearby, watching the bear family and periodically checking their condition. The bear lay motionless, only occasionally weakly licking the cubs who crawled around her belly, helplessly pawing with tiny paws. They found the nipples and began sucking, making contented snuffling sounds, but the bear was so exhausted I doubted she had any milk at all. Her sides had sunken even more. Ribs protruded under the wet fur. Eyes were half closed. I understood that if she didn't eat and drink in the next few hours, she would simply die from dehydration and exhaustion, and with her would perish the cubs who completely depended on maternal milk. The problem was I was alone at the station. The previous shift had left a week ago, and the new one was supposed to arrive 3 days ago, but their ship broke down at sea, and now they were delayed indefinitely. This meant my own food supplies were running out. A few cans of preserved food remained, some crackers, and 3 frozen fish I'd been saving for the most extreme case. I looked at the bear, at her trembling paws and sunken sides, then at the tiny cubs who squeaked pitifully, trying to suck milk from empty nipples. If the shift was delayed another week, which was quite possible with a serious ship breakdown, without these 3 fish, I myself would be on the edge of survival. But the bear would die today or tomorrow if she didn't get food, and with her would perish 2 tiny cubs who had just miraculously survived. I made my decision. I took out all 3 fish from the bright blue freezer module, thawed them in warm water and placed them right in front of the bear's muzzle, leaving myself only 1 can of preserved food and a handful of crackers. Let me risk myself, but these 3 lives are worth it. The bear at first didn't even react to the fish, but then her nostrils finally caught the scent. She slowly opened her mouth and began eating very slowly, chewing with difficulty, But she was eating, and this gave hope. By evening, she'd eaten all the fish and drunk a bowl of water I'd placed nearby, and the cubs kept nursing, and now it seemed were getting at least some milk. Because their squeaking became less desperate, I moved to the adjacent living module, leaving the door ajar to hear if something happened. All night I woke to the squeaking of cubs and the quiet rumbling of the bear, who was apparently gradually coming to herself. The next morning, water supplies ran out, and critically little food remained, and I had to leave the station to collect snow from melting and check the nets I'd set a week ago. It was a risk, leaving a hungry bear alone in the module, but without water and food, we'd all die. I pulled on my bright orange insulated jacket, took a red backpack with ropes, and went out into the icy Arctic air where the temperature had dropped to -30. The nets were located about a kilometer from the station, at the island's edge, where we conducted observations of the ecosystem and the impact of melting ice on polar bears. As I walked over packed snow, lighting the path with a yellow flashlight, one question spun in my head: what happened to the bear? 3 weeks ago, she was healthy and strong, settled in a safe place, preparing for birth. What could have happened that transformed a healthy bear into this exhausted, barely living creature, soaked through as if after a long swim in icy water? And why did labor begin prematurely, several weeks before term, when I reached the place where the nets should have been? I first thought I'd lost my way in the darkness. Instead of the familiar icy shore with ropes sticking out of ice holes, open black water spread before me, slightly steaming in the frosty air. I stopped dead and directed the flashlight beam along the coastline, the huge ice floe the size of a football field, on which the permanent bear colony was located and which had stood here immovably all the years of my work, had simply disappeared. It had broken off from shore and floated into the ocean, taking everything with it: my nets, observation equipment, and the bear's den where she was preparing to give birth. A chill ran down my spine, and it wasn't the Arctic frost. I tried to imagine what happened, and a horrifying picture formed. Most likely the bear was sleeping in her den when the ice floe began breaking off. This could have happened at night. A crack in the warmed ice suddenly widened under the action of current. The split occurred almost silently, and the ice floe floated away without even waking the animal. She woke up already in the open ocean. Around her only black, icy water and endless sky. No shore visible, just a drifting ice floe under her paws and ocean carrying her farther and farther from the island. Pregnant, in late term, ready to give birth any moment. The panic must have been incredible, maternal instinct screaming that here in the open ocean the cubs wouldn't survive. Staying on the ice floe meant inevitable death. When labor began, she'd be helpless and the floe could be carried hundreds of kilometers. She had only one way out: jump in the water and swim back. The icy water struck the large animal's body. Breath caught from cold. Ocean temperature around 0 degrees. But she had to swim. Swim while she had strength. Powerful paws cut through water, but her body so heavy from pregnancy. Babies inside moving as if sensing danger. Kilometer after kilometer, fighting current, trying to carry her back to open ocean. Waves covered her head. Salt water poured into nose and mouth. Burned eyes. Paws began going numb from cold. Lungs burned. Muscles burned from overexertion. But she couldn't stop. To stop meant to drown, meant to doom the babies who weren't even born yet. And inside, something began happening. Too early contractions caused by stress and hypothermia. Pain pierced her belly in waves. Became harder to breathe, harder to paddle, but she had to keep swimming, endure, fight. Finally, ahead appeared the silhouette of the island, but almost no strength remained. Each stroke came harder, paws barely obeyed, but shore getting closer, a little more, just a bit more. One last desperate push, paws finally scraped on rocks and ice. She crawled onto shore and just lay there, unable to move, each breath echoing with pain in her chest. Contractions intensified, labor beginning right here on the cold shore, but the babies wouldn't survive here without help. And then instinct suggested the only solution: the station, people, the last chance for salvation. I returned to the present moment, standing on shore and staring at the black water. This explained everything. Her exhaustion, wet fur, premature birth, that desperation in her eyes with which she stood at the station door. She'd made it, a miracle in itself, because many bears die trying to overcome such distances, especially pregnant ones. But this swim nearly killed the bear. If I hadn't let her in, hadn't helped with the birth, she would have died at the threshold along with her cubs. I clenched my fists in helpless rage, looking at the place where just a week ago there'd been a stable ice floe. This floe had stood here for decades, was part of the permanent coastline, but global warming caused by human actions melted the ice so much that ancient ice masses began breaking off and drifting. People throw carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, burn fuel, cut down forests somewhere far away, thousands of kilometers from here, but here in the Arctic, polar bears pay the price. Their homes literally dissolve under their paws, and they can do nothing about it. I checked the backup nets in another ice hole, which fortunately was in place. In them I found 2 small fish, kept one for myself, decided to give the bigger one to the bear. When I returned to the station and carefully entered through the service entrance, I saw the bear lying in the same place. Cubs snuffling at her belly, their tiny bodies rising and falling with her breathing. She didn't even lift her head when I appeared. I placed the fish next to her muzzle and she slowly began eating, her movements slightly more energetic than in the morning. The cubs kept nursing, and I noticed their bellies had become slightly rounder, meaning there was milk. The bear was gradually recovering. The next 2 days passed in constant care for the bear family. I shared my meager food with the bear, risking each time I approached her with another portion of fish or water, but she never showed aggression, only looked at me with her dark eyes with some incredible understanding. The cubs grew stronger by the hour. They began opening their eyes, tiny black slits from which looked a surprised and slightly cloudy gaze. Their fur became thicker and whiter, covering the pink skin, and the squeaking turned into demanding whimpering when they wanted to eat. They no longer just crawled but tried to waddle on their chubby paws, constantly falling and bumping noses into each other, which looked incredibly touching. Finally, on the 3rd morning, a long-awaited crackle sounded in the radio speaker, and a familiar voice announced the ship was repaired and the new shift of polar workers would be at the island in a few hours. When I saw the ship's silhouette in the distance, I felt such relief, I nearly collapsed. The new shift arrived in full complement, 6 people, including a veterinarian who specialized in Arctic fauna. I quickly told him about the bear, and the vet immediately went to examine her, bringing professional equipment from a green case. He conducted a thorough examination, checked the cubs who squeaked indignantly when picked up, took several samples. After half an hour he gave his verdict. The bear was recovering, exhaustion receding, cubs absolutely healthy. In a day or 2 they could be released into the wild, but the problem was the place where she'd lived no longer existed. The ice floe had floated away, and the remaining ice had become unstable and could break off at any moment. We gathered around the table in the living module and began studying island maps, looking for a suitable place for the bear family. One of the new polar workers, a young guy with good knowledge of the area, suggested the southern bay. There the coastline was more protected from currents and winds, ice thicker and more stable, and most importantly, that's where most of the seals had moved after the ice conditions changed, which meant a good food base for the bear. In this bay, there were natural shelters among coastal cliffs where a den could be arranged, protected from bad weather, and many polynyas for hunting. This place was located about 20 kilometers from the station, far enough that the bear would feel safe from humans, but close enough that we could periodically check how they were doing. The next morning, we began preparing for transport. The vet gave the bear a light sedative, just enough that she wouldn't panic but would remain conscious and could control the cubs. We built comfortable sleds from sturdy canvas and boards, lined them with thick, warm blankets of bright red and blue, and carefully transferred the bear with cubs there. The cubs squeaked indignantly, pawing with their paws, trying to find their mother, and the bear growled weakly but didn't resist, as if understanding our intentions. The sleds were attached to a powerful yellow snowmobile, and our caravan set off. The road to the southern bay took about 3 hours. We drove slowly, going around dangerous sections of thin ice and stopping every half hour to check how the bear was handling the journey. The cubs slept most of the time, curled up in balls in the warm blankets, occasionally squeaking and bumping noses into each other. The bear lay alert but calm. Her breathing was even, and in her eyes there was no longer that desperate plea I'd seen at the station door. When we reached the southern bay, we saw a truly ideal place. The coastline, protected by high cliffs, created a natural barrier from strong winds. Thick, stable ice extended far into the sea, forming a reliable platform for hunting. Many polymya's open water areas among ice meant seals regularly appeared here to breathe, and the bear would be able to hunt without spending too much energy. Among the coastal cliffs, several natural depressions were visible, ideal for arranging a den, and snowdrifts created additional protection from bad weather. This was exactly the place where the bear family could live safely. We unhitched the sleds and stepped back to a safe distance, watching what would happen next. The bear lay motionless for several minutes, as if not believing it was all over. Then she slowly rose to her paws, shook herself and looked around, her nose drawing in air, analyzing the new place. The cubs immediately began squeaking indignantly and scrambling toward her, their tiny paws slipping on the blanket. They poked their noses in the air, trying to find their mother. The bear lowered her head, sniffed both of them, made sure they were okay, and looked in our direction. For a few seconds our gazes met, and in her eyes was something like gratitude, not human, but some deep understanding that we'd helped her survive. Then she turned around, carefully took one cub by the scruff in her mouth. It immediately quieted, instinctively tucking in its paws, and slowly moved toward the nearest group of cliffs where a den could be arranged. The second cub squeaked pitifully, left on the blankets, its tiny paws helplessly pawing the air. It turned its head, trying to understand where mother and brother had gone. The bear carefully placed the first baby at the cliffs, returned, and picked up the second, who immediately fell silent, finding himself in the safety of his mother's mouth. In a minute, the whole family disappeared behind snowdrifts, leaving only a chain of tracks on white snow. We stood and silently looked at these tracks. I thought about how humans, with their actions, nearly destroyed this bear family, melted their home, forced a pregnant bear to swim on the edge of death through the icy ocean. But this family was lucky. The bear instinctively found help where there was a human ready to risk everything for their salvation. Perhaps if there are more such people, polar bears will still have a future in this melting Arctic.